As a private chef, this is how to cook the perfect steak. We've got ourselves an eye fillet steak here. Eye fillet comes from the tenderloin. Beautiful Chateaubriand cut. We're gonna be a schmack now. Select the steak depending on what you're after. There's many different types of steak. We've got sirloins with a nice thick cap. Scotch fillet has some bigger fat throughout the meat itself. Then eye fillet such as this, because there's not too much fat through it, if you were to overcook the steak, it's gonna go tough and quite dry. So we're just gonna lightly sear it, aiming for medium rare to medium, a little bit of butter at the end to add some moisture. So I've just turned the pan on, we're starting to heat the pan up. Crucial step with searing the perfect steak is making sure that we get a hot pan and a sear on the steak. We don't want to stew the steak. If the pan's too cold, the liquids are just going to come out of there. We're going to end up braising the steak instead of getting a nice sear and a nice barbecue finish. Going to generously season it with salt. It's going to add to that crust and help to get a nice sear in the end. Pan's nice and hot now. I've got it to a light smoking stage. Going to add a small amount of oil, remembering that the oil in the steak itself is going to continue to cook out as well. And using an oil that doesn't have too high of a smoke factor. We're going to then sear the steak fat side down at first. So we want to render down that piece of fat that lays underneath the steak here. Again, that's going to help to break that down, tenderize the steak, but also give us some additional juices in the pan to get a beautiful crust on this steak once we lay it down. Just checking this now. Starting to get a nice sear on there. We'll give it another 20 seconds on this side. We've got a beautiful sear now. Just going to lay that steak down on the first side. Gently pressing it down, being mindful not to squeeze any juices out, but just ensuring a flat surface and an even sear on the underside of the steak. The steak's beautifully seared on both sides now. I'm going to remove it from the pan and just begin the resting process. Got a beautiful sear on our fillet steak here. We're just going to check the internal temperature. The reason we're checking the internal temperature is just going to tell us how far through the steak has been cooked. So at the moment we're sitting at 34, 35 degrees, which is essentially raw.
This is raw!
You cut into this now, you're going to have a very raw steak inside. You'll have a nice bit of sear on the outside, but super red, a lot of blood and plasma coming out from the steak if we were to cut it as well. So a few different options for us here. We can either roast it in the oven. We can place it in the oven. I'd estimate maybe 3 or 4 minutes, bring it up to the temperature that we're looking to have it at, and then rest the steak from there. Or instead, what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a butter bath on the stove. I'm going to add some aromats like garlic and thyme to that, and then I'm actually going to finish the steak in that. So as the steak continues to cook, it's going to suck up some of that butter and some of that flavour, and it's going to add to the plumpness and the moisture within the steak, whilst making sure that it's cooked to a temperature that we're happy with and that we're going to enjoy. Garlic's now started to soften slightly. We're going to add our thyme in there, and then we're going to put our steak straight in as well. And again, using the temperature within this pan now to finish cooking the steak. So the steak has come to temperature, got a beautiful sear, really happy with the cuisson of this steak. We're just gonna now let it rest, so taking it out of the hot pan so that it doesn't continue to cook. You can see the beautiful caramelized garlic here that we used in the butter. I'm gonna add a little bit of the butter on just to help marinate it as it's cooling and resting. It's gonna suck those juices in, and then we can slice it and enjoy. This is the perfect example of why we need to rest our steak prior to slicing. We took the steak out of the hot pan, we put it on this plate to let it start resting. We added the butter sauce, but we can start to see this additional liquid coming out now. Now it's not blood, it's plasma and meat juice. It's the proteins coming out and the enzymes as well. If we were to slice this steak prior to resting, all that juice is going to run straight onto the plate, and the steak won't retain any of that moisture. By resting the steak, that's going to absorb back into the flesh, and then when we slice that steak, we'll have that same moisture throughout the meat instead of on the plate. So we've got our steak here, beautifully seared. We've rested it. It's continued to rise in temperature, so the residual heat from the steak itself has continued to cook the steak as we've let it rest. Now it's time to see how we went. When slicing a steak, very important step, we must slice across the grain. So in this particular steak here, we can see the grain is running lengthways. If we were to slice the steak with the grain, we're getting a large portion of grain, which isn't going to be as tender. Whereas if we turn the steak sideways, slice across the grain this way, we're only getting these very short fibers and membranes of the steak. So each mouthful is going to be slightly more tender than it would have otherwise, getting a better product out of the exact same steak. Ready? Slicing across the grain here. Not too thick. The thinner we slice this now, the more tender it will remain. I'm not showing us how it's cooked yet, but I have a feeling, as usual, we've nailed it. Beautiful medium rare here. The pinkness will continue to come out once this is sliced and it oxidizes, giving us a beautifully tender steak. So really happy with how this steak's turned out. Beautiful eye fillet, got a lovely sear and crust, beautiful pinkness throughout, plenty of moisture retention, and we can just see the tenderness of this steak here, literally pulling it apart. Gonna be super tender to eat and enjoy. That's why we've sliced it across the grain. And that's how to cook the perfect steak at home.